Hey guys, this is Mike Wagner. I present to you a little piece I've been working on, strength and conditioning concepts for BMX athletes. I'm a certified strength and conditioning specialist. I'm a USA BMX coach, currently finishing up my master's degree in kinesiology at Point Loma Nazarene University. And I've also got a bachelor's degree in organizational leadership from Chapman University. So let's break down the sport. Duration, intensity, volume. We have roughly 25 to 35-second lap times. It's an all-out sprint, but these short sprints are, I wouldn't say interrupted, but complemented by obstacles that cause a break in the sprint and a use or utilization of some other special strengths. The emphasis is really on the first 5 seconds here, where you can get out in front, control the line, and essentially make your lap a little bit shorter and potentially make everybody else's a bit longer by taking the ideal line choices. You must be able to repeat this multiple times a day to get through your qualifiers, quarters, semis, mains, etc., and also multiple days in a row if you're racing a 2-3 day national or maybe even a longer event such as the Race of Champions and the Grants. All right, I want to dive into fuel systems a little bit here. So how does the body get energy? So we've got these basic energy producing systems over here. You've got your anaerobic systems, which would be the phosphagen creatine system or ATP-PC. And then we also have what's called glycolysis. This would be the fast glycolysis chain here. Now, if we start adding anaerobic, we're utilizing oxygen as well for part of that metabolism. So we get what's called glucose oxidation, which would be the slow glycolysis here, and then fat oxidation, which would be beta oxidation. So looking at this, this immediate ATP-CP, this lasts roughly 5 to 10 seconds, and then it starts to deplete. And then we're utilizing primarily fast glycolysis for the rest of the energy to sustain that lap and get us here to roughly this 30-second level. So quick ramp up. This is going to be your first straight. This system's going to start to deplete, and then we're going to get some pickup here from the glycolysis, glycolytic fuel system. And then after your lap's over, we'll be in what's called a state of excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, and we're trying to utilize slow glycolysis and this beta oxidation over here to replenish and get the ATP topped back off and get the glucose and glycogen stores topped back off for that next lap. So interval training to develop those fuel systems. So shorter rest period if you're trying to increase maybe the depth of that fuel system. But if you're trying to increase the power of that fuel system and its capabilities, you'd want to go with a longer rest period to accomplish that. All right, so let's talk about some of these physical attributes involved in BMX. Everybody talks power, power, power. Power is great. We need power. We need power to accelerate. Essentially, what we want to do is we want to go from not moving at all to moving at top speed in the shortest amount of time possible. So that's acceleration. Power is a very valuable component in that equation. So we look at power. It is comprised of both force and velocity. So force would be more of this absolute strength. Velocity is, hey, how fast are we moving this? So every point here in this force velocity curve has some value. I'll dip into that here in just a minute. Top speed, how fast can we possibly get this thing going? And speed endurance, how long can we maintain that speed? And I just want to clarify here, speed endurance is technically an incorrect term. We're really talking about what's called lactate resistance here. And on the next slide, I can dive into that a little more. And then repeatability. We want to be able to do this multiple times a day, and we want our strongest laps to be at the end of our competition. So force velocity curve, absolute strength. This is kind of like that 1 rep max. Do you need to spend a lot of time here? It's debatable, but the fact is that by increasing your absolute strength, you also bring up every one of these other inherent strengths. So it deserves some attention, but it's maybe overemphasized. Accelerative strength, hey, let's get this thing moving. All right, we're trying to bring it from 0 to as fast as we possibly can. This would be maybe a little later on in that acceleration phase, maybe when we're going from that initial sprint to the drive phase. Speed strength, this would be probably more of like your top end here. And then the starting strength, this is how fast those muscles can contract with no load to kind of build that tension that it takes to ramp up and be able to perform that initial movement. All right, special strength qualities. I do want to highlight these two books right here. They've been great resources. Dr. Berko Shansky, he was a Soviet doctor involved with their training and development way back in the 60s. He's kind of the one who came up with plyometrics and the implementation of plyometrics into sport training and speed training. And then we've got this other book over here, What We Need is Speed. And this really talks about strength training, periodization, rest intervals, some of the neurological attributes to really being fast. So great resources here if you're into reading them. If not, I've already read them for you. So we'll just dive in. Speed strength, we want to be able to accelerate. Ballistic power, we want to be able to, create force at the snap of a finger. Reactive strength, we want to be able to land from a big jump and be able to pop right back off the next jump afterwards, whether that be in a rhythm section, a pro set, or if we're pumping, that would be the reactive strength quality showing up as well. Tap manual, that's a reactive strength quality. And then also maybe the G out at the bottom of a big hill would be reactive strength. Rate of force development. How quick can we get this thing to turn from 0 to full speed? So we've got this illustration right here. An untrained person, they kind of have this flatter curve. Somebody who does explosive ballistic training, they're going to be able to ramp up to this force much faster in a time than somebody who's doing primarily strength training alone. So somebody who's doing heavy resistance, even though they might be stronger in that max strength, they're not able to recruit that strength fast enough to really capture their window of opportunity to apply that strength. So sometimes max strength, like we said, it can raise all other strengths, but we also need to make sure we're working on rate of force development, reactive strength, ballistic power, some of those other things. And then we want to hit on this reactive strength index. So what we talked about was the ability to land and then change the direction as quickly as possible and explode off in the least amount of time. You want what's called a short ground contact time here. And that really shows up in your ability to handle obstacles on the track. That explosiveness sometimes shows up at a rider looking just really snappy, poppy, smooth, etc. All right, power development methods. So the biggest bang for the buck here is going to be simply sprinting, whether it's flat ground, whether it's uphill, whether it's over-geared, or at a regular gear. It could be done from a slow roll. It could be done from a sprint block. It could be done from the starting gate. It could be done with foot at the top of the stroke. There's a bunch of ways to accomplish sprint work and a bunch of little, maybe finer points in tailoring what that sprint choice is going to be towards what quality you're really trying to develop. Plyometrics, the value here is just, it's huge. And I want to jump over to this chart real here. So the neurological aspect is what makes plyometrics so stinking important. So the first thing is we get what's called stretching. You stretch out the muscle spindle. It stimulates the muscle through the activation of the sensory neuron to contract. And then that's going to send the signal here for that forceful contraction to occur. There's another component here called the Golgi tendon organ, which works to downregulate this maximum amount of strength that this muscle can produce to protect the tendon unit from detaching from the bone. So both of these qualities are trainable. We can upregulate the strength of contraction, and then we can also override some of that inhibitory aspect of that Golgi tendon organ. so we get the most potential out of that muscle. Ballistic throws, so that would be using like med balls, dynaballs, something like that. Loaded jumps, whether you're using band assisted loaded jumps or weighted jumps, something like that, or your explosive lifts. Speed development methods, this would generally be like a flat ground sprint from a rolling start, maybe even using a under gear, maybe even using a shorter crank arm length if you're trying to really develop that foot speed and work on cadence there. Or it could even be done downhill. And then interval work. Interval work is somewhat effective for developing top speed as well, but I would save these intervals for maybe on the track, maybe doing one straightaway at a time, half lap at a time, something like that. And then finally, we'll tag into the follow-up here on lactate resistance methods. So intervals, you could do intervals with an incomplete recovery to enhance your ability to resist lactate, or you could do repeats. Repeats would be maybe like a 3/4 lap, a full lap, something like that, but done with full recovery in between. Intervals could be something like half lap, 3/4 lap, or even a full lap done with maybe incomplete recovery. So let's talk about lactate a little bit here. So a lot of people talk about speed endurance. That's just, it's simply not quite correct, because it's not that the muscle itself is going through fatigue, but it's experiencing a very similar situation. So when you're running in this fast glycolysis, you're using glucose, it's incompletely broken down. The byproduct of that is lactate. Lactate accumulates and is accompanied by hydrogen ions. This shifts the pH at that cellular level. And what that does ultimately is it inhibits the ability for that muscle between the actin and myosin to contract and release, and contract and release. So it slows down that process a little bit. So that pump up and that slowing down is really more from a lactate accumulation than it is the muscles simply fatiguing. All right, so what are some common approaches to training? There's the short to long approach, where you would start out with maybe shorter distances of sprinting and interval work early in the year, and then you'd build up throughout the year. Or you could do what's called the long to short model. We do a fair bit of mountain biking earlier in the year, so we've had to adopt this long to short model, even though I tend to prefer a short to long model, just for the managing burnout and the overall work volume. So Tyler comes off a mountain bike season where he's doing events that are, anywhere from 2 to 4 minutes of work, and maybe 3 to 5 of those in a given competition day with a practice day before. So we're really taking 2 to 4 minutes of work that he's doing at the beginning of the year, and then we're paring that back and bringing up the intensity to weave back into the demands for BMX. So you could do what's called block periodization or undulating periodization. So these blocks, they could be where you're doing like maybe a strength block or a hypertrophy block or a power block, or something a little more strict and focused. Or what I think works better for a sprint athlete, especially with the duration of the season and the frequency of races in USA BMX, is undulating periodization. So in undulating periodization, we would still be giving attention to each quality, but we'd maybe be prioritizing the qualities that we're trying to develop. So we want to maintain strength, we want to improve power, we want to develop lactate resistance, we want to develop that top speed. So you can either do undulating periodization to where you have a mixed workout, or you could keep the workouts in itself strict and tailored to what you're trying to accomplish, but you'd have a mixture of different workouts through a week. So let's jump into this. A microcycle. A microcycle is usually a week in duration. It could be a little bit longer, a little bit shorter if you've got a race and you need to make some adjustments there. Mesocycle, this is generally anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks, most common being 4 weeks. And what you see here is a progressive ramp up, 1, 2, 3 weeks of progressive ramp up. And then you have an unloading week, which would either be used for competition or testing. 1, 2, 3 weeks of progressive overload, and then a deload where you'd be testing, et cetera. So you could just see kind of how these different blocks are built throughout a cycle. And then finally, a macro cycle, which is generally a 1-year plan. Now, if you're looking to prepare for like the Olympics or something like that, it could go up to potentially a 4-year plan. So what we talk about here, we want to build, we want to taper, and then we usually have a peak performance after we unload a little bit. So the overall system would look like we're building up for a couple weeks, we're going to taper back the workload, and we're expecting a peak of performance in there. That's just kind of how the body works. If you're doing BMX, usually we want to shoot for like either a 1 or a 2 peak season, with the second peak of the year being grands and maybe the other peak of the year being where your sweet spot is in the year to get your national points, or maybe it's the worlds, something like that. If you try to stay at peak performance too long, ultimately you run a high risk of developing overtraining syndrome, burnout, or injury. So we want to be real careful on managing those workloads. Some special considerations here is what we call the acute to chronic workload ratio. So we don't want to tap the body with too much more than what the body's already used to. We generally only want to increase by about 10% per week. Anything more than that, your acute to chronic workload ratio gets out of whack, and you might actually start to see a decrease in performance rather than an increase in performance. That could show up in many different ways. People getting moody, irritable, immune system breaking down, a little more cough, a little more cold, decreases in heart rate variability, decreases in appetite, difficulty sleeping, loss of performance, et cetera. We need to pay special attention to central nervous system rebound times. A really taxing sprint session or interval session could really take about 72 hours for the nervous system to bounce back. And that's considering it was fresh going into that session to begin with. And then collagen. Collagen doesn't get as much blood supply as the muscle fibers do. But collagen is primarily what makes up the tendons and the ligaments. Very, very important for that connective structure. And doing extensive plyometric work or sprint work, that type of stuff, that could put a pretty good taxing on the collagen. And before you're at a collagen gain, so a net gain in collagen, that could sometimes be anywhere from 48 to 72 hours because it takes a little longer to heal and repair. And then pre-competition priming. Sometimes the day before a competition, it is wise to do a very short but intense workout with very healthy doses of rest. And I mean very low, like maybe simply a couple sprints, a couple plyometric moves, and you're done, to prime the body for athletic competition. The window there is usually like 8 to 36 hours of benefit there. And it's a pretty small benefit, but there is a benefit. If we're chasing every percent, might as well not ignore that. All right, so some weekly templates. I just kind of sketched out for you guys some ideal weekly templates. It could be done in so many different ways, shapes, and formats, depending on when your track days are, when your sprint days are, when your strength days are, whether you're a homeschool athlete or you're a professional athlete, or somebody like my kid who's going to public school. And we generally try to get, one workout a day, probably 4 to 5 days a week, whether that's a track workout or some sprints and strength combined. As you can see in each one of these, we have one active recovery day, one rest day. Active recovery day, one rest day. Those recovery and rest days are so stinking important, and the timing and positioning of it is very critical as well. So, here we use Training Peaks for the delivery of most of our programming. That way we can track metrics and kind of get that good overall picture of what's going on. So maybe like a light sprint combo, and then go out to the track and catch some technique work, or maybe we're going out and we're knocking out half laps, something like that. And then train heroic. This would be maybe just a template for a strength training session. million different ways to weave this together. There's a bunch of good ways that work, and then there's a whole lot of ways that don't work. So the truth is, any template can work. The key is workload management. If you're truly trying to develop speed or power, it needs to be done when you're fully recovered. So you show up to the session fresh and you're fully recovered in between each effort. Different athletes have different needs and strengths. Some athletes are going to be force dominant where they're really strong, but maybe not so explosive and poppy. And then other athletes might be very explosive and poppy, but lack that overall strength, or they might be somebody who tends to blow up on that second, third straightaway. And then we need to work more on the development of lactate resistance qualities. I'm a big believer in the long-term athletic development model. So what that means is we don't want to specialize with an athlete too soon. We really want to take them from child to champion, and we want to expose them to different sports, different movement patterns, different loading patterns, different durations of exercise and intensity of exercise to work on those different fuel systems. And as these young athletes grow up, naturally they will kind of see what they're drawn towards, what they're built for genetically, and you have the ability to develop any attributes over a long period of time, rather than looking for these overnight fixes or get rich quick or get fast quick schemes. Those truly just don't work. They come with consequences, potentially long-term damaging and career-ending consequences. So we're all about the long-term athletic development model. And then we want to talk about specific adaptations to impose demands. It's the SAID principle. I believe this was Hans Selye. So what we're looking for here is, if you want to get faster at the first straight, you probably need to be doing sprinting. If you need to get better at those rhythm sections and bigger on those maybe pro sets or G out, something like that, well, then you need to be looking more at like your reactive strength qualities and that type of stuff. Where I think a lot of what's going on currently is we've got some very talented athletes who have came through. They're now filling coach and training roles, and maybe they're still learning some of these finer points in strength and conditioning practices, so they can really tailor a program to a specific athlete rather than doing like a rinse, wash, repeat of what worked for them or what worked for somebody else. So I think that's where we need to get better as a sport. That's one of the things I'm really looking to accomplish here moving forward. All right, important details. Work to rest ratios. They're huge, but they need to be intent-based. So like I said, if we're trying to develop lactate resistance, hey, we might be using shorter rest ratios and stretching out that work to deepen that well of what's called capillary density, mitochondrial density, those things that assist, and also try to really get those enzymes developed to help buffer the lactate as well. Or if we're trying to get that speed and power, well, then we need a lot more rest and a lot shorter duration. Sprint timers, I'm a big fan of sprint timers. I use them primarily to evaluate my fatigue, residual fatigue coming into a session. And then whenever the athlete has a slowing of their times, that would be an indicator that we either need to stretch the rest period out between sprints, or that we simply need to cut the session short and maybe refocus on recovery. Cadence sensors, I love cadence sensors. This is what I think is low-hanging fruit. Speed and power on some aspects take a lot to develop from just the physical standpoint, but the technical standpoint of learning how to pedal in a circle and really spin that thing up, that's something that could be developed pretty quickly. So having the ability to track that cadence and see how much you're improving, that I feel is important. And then recovery trackers, you could get away without using this, but if you want to really get towards the upper levels of what you're capable of, we need to be looking at your sleep quality and duration. We need to be looking at your resting heart rate. We need to be looking at that heart rate variability and really assessing how your body's doing with the stress response that we're throwing at it, and making sure that it's able to absorb that allostatic stress load and repair and rebound and perform at a high level. So big factors there. Luxury items. We've got a velocity-based training device here. This is awesome tool. I'll show you guys why here in just a little bit. Compression pants. Yeah, this is like the sprinkles on the cake. I personally don't own compression pants. We don't really do cold immersion. Cold immersion could be something done to reduce inflammation. It does affect protein synthesis. So this probably needs to be done either before a workout, a few hours after a workout, or it could also be done on a race weekend in between multiple days to keep the inflammation at bay, because you're not really getting like full resynthesis of protein or collagen or anything else in that short window between multiple days of competition. So cold immersion could be a useful tool there to keep the inflammation at a minimum. Sauna is a great way to promote vasodilation, to promote sweat. There is some benefits here as far as what we call HPA axis, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So between cold immersion and sauna, we increase that HPA axis, and that's basically just the body's ability to absorb and buffer stress. All right, questions? Let me go back. I've got one question that I did not do a good enough job of explaining that I want to go back to. So we talked about this force velocity curve, and we also talked about why this is important with that velocity-based trainer. So if I want to highlight a certain quality, we could use that velocity-based trainer. We could find out exactly what velocity zone we want to be working in to develop that quality or attribute, and then we work there. And the other cool thing about it is we use that velocity to track when we're showing signs of nervous system fatigue. So like a 10% drop in velocity or a 10% addition in velocity, sorry, we're getting 10% slower. That's when we'd cut it short if we're trying to develop speed or power. If you're trying to develop strength, you could go up to about 20% of change in velocity, loss in velocity. And if you're working on like hypertrophy, then you could potentially go all the way up to 30%. Now the risk there, if you go all the way up to that 30% drop in reduction in velocity, you're going to be sore for a bit longer. It's going to take longer for your body to repair. So your sessions are going to have to be spaced further apart. Where if you utilize that 10% velocity drop, well, then you can hit sessions much more frequently and really get those development attributes that we're after. All right, guys, my contact information, Mike, onelifehealthandfitness.com. You can catch us on Instagram. You can catch us on Facebook. And we're also on YouTube. So give us a like, give us a follow if you see any value in what we're doing. And yeah, give us some feedback. Let us know what you'd like to see in the future. Have a great one.